Good morning and welcome. My name is Constance Sayers. I am the president of Government Executive Media Group. And on behalf of NextGov, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's event, The Rise of the Chief Data Officer. Before we begin the program today, though, I'd like you to just a few housekeeping announcements so that we can have your full attention this morning. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. We do want this to be a lively discussion. We want you to tell us how we're doing this morning. We welcome your comments, your questions, and your thoughts on this event via Twitter at #CDOInsights. That's #CDOInsights. At your chair, you'll also find an evaluation form for today's event. We always value your feedback, so please take a moment to complete the survey at the end of this briefing. I'd also like to recognize our exclusive underwriter for today's event, Dun & Bradstreet. Without them, this event would not be possible, so thank you. It's now my pleasure to kick off our program and introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, Micheline Casey. Ms. Casey is the Chief Data Officer at the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System. She heads the Office of the Chief Data Officer and Enterprise Data Management Service Organization and leads the transformation of data management and information sharing across the board. She's responsible for the development and implementation of the board's data strategy and oversees teams responsible for both strategic and operational data management functions. She also provides thought leadership to board senior executive level division directors around data innovation. Ms. Casey is a private and public sector senior executive with almost 20 years' experience. Among her achievements, she was the first state government chief data officer in the country and was responsible for developing and executing the state of Colorado's enterprise data strategy and data governance and management framework across the state's executive branch agencies. Her private sector experience includes jobs at ChoicePoint Government Services, now LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and IBM Global Services. Ms. Casey has won several honors, including DC's Top 50 Women in Technology and the 2011 Top 25 Information Managers. Please join me in welcoming Micheline Casey.
Good morning. I'm amazed at how early people get up in this city to come out, especially on such a hot day. But thank you for coming out. I'm still caffeinating, so bear with me as we go through this. I've got about 30 minutes. Someone wave at me when there's like 5 minutes left, and I'll speed up. But what I wanted to do, and I appreciate the opportunity, extend my thanks to Frank and Camille and Connie and the team for having me here. Is kind of talk about what we're doing at the Federal Reserve really quickly, and then try to tee up the really interesting panel that's coming up after me to talk about the evolving nature of this role. Do you actually need one? And what on earth should something like a chief data officer actually be doing? But let's get started with why we have one at the Fed. So I have a philosophy that you should never waste a good crisis. And about 8 years ago, there was one. And the Federal Reserve realized that it was drowning in more data than it ever had been in its life. Because of the Dodd-Frank Act and the Volcker Rule, we're going to be collecting much more data, and not just more raw data files, but actually thousands and thousands of pages of unstructured documents in the form of bank supervisory, bank exam documents. And with high computing power, what could we do to take advantage of all that and help our economists and bank supervisors and monetary policy people actually help connect the dots more ably than previously they'd been able to? The types of data that we're dealing with, that we've dealt with historically at the Federal Reserve as a 100-year-old organization, has traditionally been macroeconomic data, some financial institution data, and some survey data. But post-financial crisis, we've seen an explosion, and particularly in the last 10 years, we've seen an explosion of just purely the volume of data that's available, especially emerging types of data, which I'm going to get to in a minute. There's much more data that we can buy from vendors like Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, and Moody's. And the types of micro-level data that we are now required to collect from the financial institutions for supervisory purposes has just exploded. And so we're bringing to bear the increasing sources of data, the high performance computing in the back end, with someone who can oversee and pull together a strategy for how to modernize the infrastructure to take advantage of all of these things. So the board in its wisdom decided that we, given everything that's going on, we need a completely new approach to this. We cannot keep just adding one person at a time to solve these problems. We actually need to approach the thinking and how we do all of this work in a completely different way. So in 2012, as part of their strategic planning efforts, they created the Office of the Chief Data Officer. These are the three thematic approaches that I am responsible for as part of Theme 2 of our strategic plan for 2012-2015. This is available, by the way, out on the board's website, not my presentation, but our 2012 to 2015 strategic plan. So if you want to see the actual language around this, you can. Theme 1, by the way, was financial stability. We all kind of thought that financial stability was kind of important from a mission statement. But Theme 2 is improving data management and data governance at the board. So I inherited a really nice mission and a buy-in from senior executives from across the board that understand that as a data-driven organization, being able to really optimize and leverage the data that we've got is increasingly complicated, and we really needed some folks to pay attention to it. So our vision as the Office of the Chief Data Officer is to enable the seamless use of data as a strategic asset in support of all the board's missions. So the board doesn't just do monetary policy, and we don't just do bank supervision. We actually have 5 key mission areas, which include consumer and community affairs and economic research. But as an office, the way we're structured is strategic program direction at the top, which is myself and my deputy. And then we've got strategy, policy, and innovation, which includes our enterprise-looking groups such as enterprise data governance, enterprise data architecture, and enterprise data strategy. On the far right, you'll see our operational arms, our data management business services teams, and these are the teams that contract with specific customers across the board's divisions to actually provide data management services. This includes everything from ushering new information collections in through the PRA processes, and for those of you who are in federal agencies who collect lots of data, you know what I mean by the PRA processes, which is really the front end of our data supply chain for financial institution data. They're a really important unit, and we're pivoting them now to actually be more in line with the data governance and data standards work that we're trying to do from a strategic perspective. And then we've got a team that pulls in all the data sets that we use for monetary policy and economic research purposes. There's over 200 plus data sets that we pull in. So the only thing that really is from a pure data perspective that isn't in our wheel wagon today is all the data that we collect from financial institutions, and that comes in through the IT department, and that's historically where that's happened. And sitting in the middle of strategy and operations is our program management office. And our program management office is set up to do a couple things. As a new office, we've existed now for a little over 2 years. We are still in startup mode as a new office. They're there to help us establish our brand, our value, and communicate to the broader organization why this is needed, why our operations are important, and the value that we add to the organization. And then tactically, with all the initiatives we've got going on, they do traditional project management, comms, training, and change management, which is both important from a strategic level as well as a tactical level as we're rolling through initiatives. One of the key things that we've been working on over the past couple of years is our enterprise governance framework. We've got our governance council, which we call the Board Data Council. That's existed for over 2 years, and that's comprised of senior officers from all the board's divisions, except for one, and 2 representatives from the Federal Reserve System. For those of you who don't understand the complexities of the board and the system, the Federal Reserve Board is a government agency. The 12 reserve banks are private sector organizations with just loose oversight to the board, but we intersect in lots of ways for lots of obvious reasons. But we also have what we call national lines of business, such as bank supervision, where policy is actually run out of DC, but bank supervisors and examiners can exist in any of the reserve banks. Wells Fargo is actually overseen by the San Francisco Fed, and JP Morgan Chase is overseen by the New York Fed, and SunTrust by the Atlanta Fed. But all of those data are considered board-owned data assets, and so roll up into me in terms of scope of authority. So we've got representatives from the Federal Reserve System as part of that council. And these folks are there to help us as an office set strategic priorities, determine of the million things we could be doing on a daily basis, what's most important to meet the business needs today and the emerging business needs of the organization going forward, so that we are extremely business driven in how we run our shop and how we prioritize the work efforts that we've got. And then we've got teams of data stewards across the organization that we're just in the process of standing up now that provide sort of the middle two layers and do a lot of the heavy lifting on the how things actually get executed. And then equally as importantly, on the infrastructure side, we're doing a lot of work in terms of modernizing the entire data supply chain. Everything from upfront, how we decide to collect data, what data we collect, and the best methods for actually getting that data in-house and getting it stored. The teams that I manage today, the monetary policy data, that's all moving from 200 plus Perl scripts to a Hadoop cluster on the back end. So we're really doing a lot of work in that area. And again, we're dealing with a lot more unstructured data than the board has ever been used to, the reserve system has ever been used to. And so how do we manage that, integrate that, do things like running text analytics off of that to pull the insights we need out of those supervisory documents and integrate that with the raw structured data for like the stress test data and things like that. So there's a lot going on right now in terms of the infrastructure components, and will continue to be, because these are multi-year efforts. These aren't things that just happen overnight. We've got 5 to 10 years worth of plans around modernizing the infrastructure. So I was asked to talk about cool stuff that we're doing at the Fed. So I want to give you one example of something we're doing, and it's an area that I find extremely fascinating, an area called Nowcasting. So one of the things we do, you guys all know this, is set monetary policy for the United States, what's happening with interest rates, for example. Don't ask me, it's above my pay grade, it's above my security clearance, I do not know, so don't ask that as part of the questions. But we've been doing this for a really long time, and we've been doing it in ways, in processes that have existed in a really long time. They're really statistically accurate. They have a high amount of integrity in terms of how they actually do the forecasting processes. I'm not an economist, by the way, so please don't ask me any econometric questions as well. But the way that we've traditionally done this work is by using lagging indicator data. It's a month old, it's 3 months old, it's 6 months old. These data sets go through lots and lots of revisions over the course of time. Our other federal statistical agency brethren do a great job of pulling together really high quality data, but they're subject to lots of revisions, and it's just a problematic set of processes. So we traditionally drive by looking in the rearview mirror, right? But there's a lot of new data out there. Explosion of data in the past 10 years, everything from mobile device data to sensor data to internet and e-commerce data. What else could we be doing to identify new markets and segments to measure, or new types of data that we could be ingesting as just another set of signals that we can tie into our very rigorous economic forecasting processes? So if we think about things like what LinkedIn is doing with jobs data, would they have something that might be more timely for us to get than what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is able to provide to us on a monthly basis? If we think about sensors across the supply chain, instead of just looking at retail sales at the end of the month, are we able to look to see when shipping containers are actually leaving the docks, and is that an indicator of economic health? If we're able to look at traffic patterns in and out of cities, what does that tell us about the economic health and vibrancy of a city? As we look at new sectors that are coming out and disruptors of existing sectors, what could Tesla do to the automotive industry, and what should we be paying attention to there? The sharing economy, whether we're talking about Uber or bike share programs, what does that do to the automotive industry? So these are all questions our economists think about and puzzle about, and for the past couple of years have been really involved in looking at what high frequency data could we be getting, what alternative sources of data could be out there to help support the really rigorous set of work that we're doing internally. And while that all seems easy and obvious, it's not really, and there's some risks that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the term that we use, and I think is a general econometric term, is nowcasting versus forecasting. And the symbol I like to use is we're trying to get a fit band for the economy, right? Everyone understands what a fit band tells you in terms of what's going on with your body. Well, what can we do in terms of understanding the economic health and well-being of the country in nearer real time today? Certainly, we don't need real time because we're not running transactions, we're not an e-commerce site, and need to get out lots and lots of product, but we are a policy shop and we need to be thinking about things differently. So some of the challenges we've got and the emerging business needs that we have around this for our economists are, the indicators lag, which are often challenging. We're not getting as much detail as we'd like to in some sectors or with some types of data. With some of these newer data sets, we could get more detail than we've previously gotten. A really good example of this is in the small business sector, which has traditionally been really hard to measure. If we're able to get data from companies like Square or Thumbtack or others providing services in the small business sector, could that give us better detail, more micro-level detail than we've previously been able to get? And because our monetary policy people meet every 6 to 8 weeks, to the extent that we can get them data in faster, that's of a good quality, that's become an increasingly important need given the pressure that we've got globally on the accuracy of our forecasting statements. So with regards to how we're implementing this, it's definitely a collaborative effort between our research economists and monetary policy people, as well as the OCDO. The economists are doing the heavy lifting today on exploring what data sets are actually out there, what's possible with them, what products they could be pulling in and leveraging. Having folks in-house with the right set of skills to actually manage these newer types of data is something that we have to grapple with, as well as the business development types of skills that are needed to deal with these newer types of data and new companies that pop up. It's hard to tell if in 5 years Uber will still be around. And do we really want economists spending a lot of their time developing relationships with an Uber or a Lyft or an Airbnb if in 5 years those companies might not exist? And those are different types of skills that our economists traditionally have. And then within the Office of the Chief Data Officer, we're working on getting an innovation lab stood up that can support essentially just sandboxing around with these data, being able to match them up, being able to understand not just the value of the data themselves, but ultimately if we put them into a production process, what does it mean to actually manage these data on a daily, weekly, monthly basis from a pure data management perspective. The risks, though, that we've got is some of these data sets are pretty new. You know, if you look at Google Trends data, that's existed since 2004. That's only a decade, and that sounds like a long time. But for the work our economists do, which are they're used to time series that span, you know, we've got statistical output that goes back to like the 1920s, and they're dealing with years and years and years of data. We might not be able to get as much as we need out of these, and they present a much riskier prospect for us. There's certainly sample bias in a lot of the data that we look at, though there is sample bias in the data that we get today. So we're looking at different types of sample bias. Certainly not everybody in the United States has a smartphone. Lots of people do, but they tend to be of a certain demographic type. And so we've got other things that we need to think about in terms of understanding what's coming in with these data sets. And certainly the ability for us to consistently manage those relationships over time, and as those young companies grow, merge, have exit strategies and exit events, those things may or may not be useful to us from a longer term perspective. So with that as the cool stuff, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and tee up the next panel that's coming after this. So one of the I think big existential questions that you guys are going to be talking about today is why does someone actually need a chief data officer, and does every organization actually need one? You know, the role itself has existed for over a decade. While I was the first state government chief data officer, I was definitely not the first chief data officer. And it's for obvious reasons. You know, there's not only been an explosion of data, but explosion of high performance computing on the backside makes CIO roles really, really challenging and really difficult. And so I think we've seen over the last decade or so, CIOs evolving much more into infrastructure officers versus information officers. And they're not even dealing with things like data security. They've got CISOs to deal with that, right? So who's actually looking out for the data needs of the organization? Who's actually supporting defining the business rules, processes, and best practices around particular data sets, thinking about the strategy of data vis-a-vis the organizational missions? Well, today it's not really happening in the CIO shop. And so a lot of what CDOs do, at least in my experience, is actually deal with those issues. But how this chief data officer role looks really depends on what the organization's missions and needs are. You know, there's probably several chief data officers in the room and several in federal government right now, as well as state and local government. Those folks tend to be really focused on open data, not a lot of actual data management functions within those shops. And that's a different viewpoint than what I've got at the Federal Reserve, where I have very real operational teams. We're doing strategy, not just open data. In fact, any one of you could point to us and say, yeah, you're not really doing open data at all, and that would be a fairly accurate statement. You know, the span of authority that we've all got differs depending on organizational needs, even in the private sector. And I think over the next decade, we're really going to see this role continue to evolve, but start to settle down a little bit. I report into the board's chief operating officer, which is a fairly new role in the board itself. I think that role has only existed for 4 or 5 years now. Oftentimes, chief data officers report into the CIOs. That was what my reporting structure was in the state of Colorado. I reported into the Office of Information Technology and the CIO in the governor's office, but we didn't have a COO structure in the state. Quite frankly, I have written about this and talked about this for a long time. I think the CDO is better off sitting on the business side or under a chief operating officer or chief risk officer, so that they can be technology agnostic and really be focusing on business side issues and business drivers and not just be focused on the technology. But there are a lot of technical issues that we all have to deal with. So what are the risks that we have and what are the opportunities we have as chief data officers? So this is from years of experience of being a chief data officer. But really, you know, the number one risk is what level of support do you actually get? You know, it's one thing for the Federal Reserve or the Department of Energy or the Department of Transportation to put down on paper that they want a chief data officer, and for folks around the table to nod their heads and say, yeah, we need one of those. But day in, day out, are there people showing up to meetings? Are people incentivized to actually play well together around data and actually solve problems? Those are 2 really different questions and 2 really different levels of buy-in and support. And without that senior leadership buy-in, forget it, it doesn't go anywhere. Budget and level of commitment. I'm going to talk about that one a little bit later. But I would generally say across my colleagues in the federal sector and even at state government, where there are now more chief data officers, there is not enough resource put into these offices to actually allow them to do the things that they could be doing. Technology strategies. How many of you folks sitting in federal agencies actually have a technology strategy? One. Okay, we've got one technology strategy. 2, 3. Okay, there are a couple. We don't have one. And it's a big gap. And for lots of the things that we need to do, right now I am kind of the default technology strategist, and that's not really what I was hired to do. But I have to do it because for the things that we need to do, I have to have improved infrastructure on the back end. So I'm kind of doing both roles right now. All the policies in the world and all the data standards I set are a really nice thing, but without technology to enable it and to do it better, I don't get very far. Transforming the culture to data-centric and data-driven. So lots of us in federal agencies are actually really data-driven shops, right? We're not producing cars. We're not like selling candy bars. But actually having a mindset and set of incentives and culture and a strategy that aligns resources around actually managing data as an asset is a completely different mindset, I think, to most agencies and to many private sector organizations. Tons of opportunities, though. And one of the things I want to talk about specifically is, you know, we deal with laws and regulations as federal agencies that the private sector are not hindered by, but it does hamper our ability to kind of shift on the dime and adapt to emerging business needs. One of the struggles that we kind of grapple with today are the PRA processes, the Paperwork Reduction Act processes, and what we can and can't do vis-a-vis getting new data collections in-house and giving emerging data needs like, oh crap, the financial system is collapsing, but it's going to take us a year to 2 years to actually get the data in-house, doesn't really help us necessarily solve the problems that everyone globally is sort of expecting us to solve. Optimizing data ingestion and storage, I think we're all dealing with lots and lots of legacy that is fairly outdated, but there's good opportunities to start doing, some early pilots around some things. Improving citizen and business service delivery, I think, should be a big one that's on everybody's mind here in this room. We've got lots of data. What can we actually do to deliver more user-driven experiences and user-driven services? I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go quickly through my next slides. So, expectations of the role. When I came into the Fed, I was I was trotted around as sort of this unicorn, like we found one. We found a chief data officer. Wow, look at her. And since we all live in DC, you could be high, actually. And that's like legal and that's cool. I don't care. I come from Colorado where that was also legal and cool and I don't care. But the reality is it's really difficult to do this job. If you're going to do this job well, you need resources, you need budget. You can't be a one-person show against an organization of 2,500 or 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 people scattered across the country dealing with that much inertia by yourself. That doesn't work. And if you as an agency are going to bring in a chief data officer and not give them any people and not give them any money, but expect them to walk around and get people to do things, you're setting that person and your organization up for failure. And it'll be a disaster. And quite frankly, it's really tough to live with that every day as a human being when you want to do such good work and you can see the possibilities. I have 46 people on my team, close to 50. So I've got a nicely built team, but I think I know that there are other federal chief data officers who don't have that many resources. And their jobs are really challenging and really particularly hard. And I think it's really unfair for senior leaders to do that, actually, to people and to the organization. So what I'd like to see, hopefully, come out of the federal agencies over the next few years is really to take this role seriously and invest in them the dollars and the resources they need to do their job from an enterprise scale perspective, the same way we do with the chief information officers and chief information security officers. So what's the future? Well, you guys are going to talk about that a little bit more in your panel. We'll get into this. I don't think it looks like that guy in the image. There's no holy grail. I used to work for a company called ChoicePoint, which was doing big data and big brotherish things back in the day before big data was a term. And I used to laugh at people who thought government was actually Big Brother, and like they can't even connect the dots. Look at what we can do as a data broker. Like it's really scary. So I don't think we're anywhere close to being able to minority report people here. But there is a lot of opportunity for us to do a lot more with the data we have and optimize the data that we've got in-house. I don't think every agency needs one, and I think certainly if you just want to have one to check the box off, don't do it. If you're going to do it, like be serious about it. Again, that's resources, that's budget, that is commitment to changing the culture and having a strategy around how to leverage your data on behalf of the citizens of this country. Over the next few years, we're going to see a lot more of chief data scientists as well. And what does that look like and what does that mean and how does that intersect with the CDO role and the CIO role and the chief technology officer role? I think there's a lot of shuffling of seats that will likely happen over the next 10 to 20 years. We're all doing things that need to happen on behalf of the organizations because, again, the technology community is changing far too fast for any one role to keep up with that. There's room for all of us to play, but I haven't always seen those roles play really well together, and it shouldn't be about our particular divisions and our particular budgets. It should be on behalf of our agency, the agency missions, and the citizens and businesses of the United States. So that's what I have, and I'll take some questions. Anna, did I meet your needs? Did I hit? Connie, how much time do I have? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What data sets do you exclude of the ones that are within your purview? Like you have your internal data, your HR, your contracting, your
Yeah, great question.
entities,
Yeah, so we actually went through a really interesting exercise this past year to figure out what was actually in and out of scope. When I say enterprise data and board-owned data, like what does that really mean? And there's a lot of gray area, but what's in scope are things that are with the board's mission, so economic research data, bank supervisory data. What's clearly out of scope are things like our law enforcement data, human resources data, procurement data, and then there's some gray area in the middle where things are sitting in a division like bank supervision, but it's a directive down to the reserve banks. Is that in or out? Are the governor's testimonies in or out? Those things are out. We work really closely with our records management team and our legal team and our cybersecurity people to make sure that we're all sitting at the table when we're having these discussions, as well as the business side, to kind of delineate those lines. Great question, though.
What's the difference, in your opinion, between a chief digital officer and a chief data officer?
Oh, that's a really good question, too. I didn't even include chief digital officers. So with regards to the digital officers, I feel like that's much more about leveraging emerging technologies, such as social media and other things like that, to be able to communicate and engage. Versus the actual management and operations of the data itself. I think we've definitely moved into this world of systems of engagement and how we communicate and engage, whether we're talking about LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or link internally, any other number of other sources are really more in terms of collaborative platforms and outreach platforms and how technology gets leveraged in terms of communication, engagement, and outreach is more in the purview of the chief digital officer. You wrap up? Wrap up? I am getting the hook. All right. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Micheline Casey, for that really wonderful discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Scripignano. He is the Chief Data Officer of Dun & Bradstreet, and Dun & Bradstreet is our exclusive underwriter for today's event. Dr. Scripignano has more than 35 years' experience in information technologies, Big Four management consulting, and international business. He leverages deep data expertise and global network to position Dun & Bradstreet with strategic customers, partners, governments, and the data science community. He's a key thought leader in D&B's worldwide efforts to discover, create, and synthesize business information in multiple languages, geographies, and contexts. Dr. Scripignano also regularly confers with key customers on emerging trends in global data science, and really what we were talking about, you really travel or work with governments around the world. He was profiled by Information Week in a special series, Big Data, Big Decisions, and by BizCloud regarding big data problem formulation and data privacy. He was also published in the May 2014 edition of CIO Review in an article titled The Future Belongs to the Informed. He holds a PhD in leadership change from Antioch University. He received an MBA from Columbia University, and he was awarded the Jack M. Popper Award for achievement there. He also holds a BS and an MA in computer science from Montclair State University, where he is a 2015 recipient of the Distinguished Alumni Award. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
It's my pleasure.
You really could both ask and answer the questions.
I think that's summary dork, right?
Oh. So let's get started. As a chief data scientist, what are the top challenges you face?
Well, I think we just heard them. I was sitting there scribbling notes because it's so nice to hear someone else say, we're not crazy. We understand disruptive technologies, we understand mobile, social, cloud, all those things, and that's great.
Yeah.
But when it all comes down to it, it's about discovery, curation, synthesis of information. And really, how are you going to do that in a world where more than 85% of the data is unstructured? Right? We're drowning in data. Our problem isn't how do we go get more data. Our problem is what we just heard. How do you make sense out of it? When the regressive techniques that we normally use to model things that are very safe, that will protect us in court, that will, don't work because this data didn't exist 11 milliseconds ago, right? Do you just ignore it because you don't have longitudinal data set, or do you use some sort of non-regressive method to go and look at that data, and if you do, what are the risks of doing that? How do you know you're right? I love the idea of the Fitbit for the organization, right? How do you know if your pulse is high while you're exercising, that's a good thing, or that you're about to have a heart attack, right? Well, I don't know, I never had a heart attack before. I hope I never learned that, right? So, it's being able to use this information in ways that we probably never thought about before, and the awesome opportunity and also the awesome risk of getting that wrong. I think somewhere buried in all of that is, the challenges that we face is you have to be able to step back as a data officer and not just say, more data, please, right? We have all the data we want, right? It's about making constructive use of that data and consciously making decisions about what we are going to use and what we're not going to use. An example I like to use all the time, no one in this room is thinking about how their shoes feel. Now you're all thinking about how your shoes feel, right? And now some people are trying not to think about how their shoes feel, right? Our brains can do that automatically. We have this neural network that we're born with, right? We don't have those yet, right? So when we see a new set of data that's available to the enterprise, you can't just say, well, bring it in and let's see what we can do with it, because there's an opportunity cost. While you're doing that, you're not doing something else, and it's just changing too fast. We've got to be better than that.
Well, what are the biggest opportunities that you foresee in shaping data management and the analytics environment?
We've got to fix the software in between our ears, right? We've got to be able to, we talk about problem formulation. We've got to be able to ask different questions when we don't know how big the universe is, when we don't know what this data means yet. There's one good example is to grossly oversimplify it, there's 3 sets of data in every problem. There's the data you already have, there's the data you can easily go and get, and there's the data that you're probably never going to get, or you're only going to get with some sort of special consideration. If you don't understand the relative size of those 3 universes, how dare you make a decision with the data you have or the data you can go get if you yell loud enough, right? That might be 10% of the data that's available. So problem formulation says before you rush to collecting the data, the scientific method says you formulate a hypothesis, and then you go and look at what's been done in that area, and then you construct a methodology, you defend that methodology, and then you collect the data. Well, we tend to skip those first 4 steps, right? Go get the data, and then we'll figure out what it means. Get what data? What's the question we're asking? And how do we know that's the right question? Got to slow down enough to ask those questions.
That's really great.
Thank you.
There is, we were talking about this, an oversimplification of the open data discussion. Many have talked about simply making the data open and free to everyone, but that's actually a really difficult process. How do you take all this data and make it storable, searchable, usable, and accurately make decisions from the data?
So no one would say all drugs should be openly available and free to everyone, right? We understand that there's a certain knowledge that you need to have in order to be able to use them, and we want them to be current, and we want them to be of the right quality and all of that. And we say, well, there's certain drugs that you can go into a supermarket and buy, and that's okay. And I think to some extent this is a good analogy for this conversation. It's not that all data should be open and free, and it's not that all data should be sitting behind somebody's firewall and you got to come to the shaman to get the data, right? It's somewhere in between. There's data, I think that with all due respect to the National Weather Service, I should be able to know what the temperature is outside without somebody interpreting that for me, right? But maybe, I'm not so good with the Doppler radar, without Dr. Frank Field telling me what that means, right? So I think that we need to take that kind of an approach with data and say that certain data, we at Dun & Bradstreet, we deal with data that has all of the V's in it, volume, variety, veracity, value. We have to think about, is it true? Just because someone claims to have 1,000 employees, well, you have 1,000 people you can call when you need them, but you're not actually paying them until you get work. They're not employees, right? You say you were in business 15 years because 15 years ago you thought about this business, right? That doesn't mean you're in business 15 years. And those are sort of sins of benevolent commission. I'm not trying to defraud you. I'm just, my hopes and aspirations are bigger than reality, right? What about when I lie? And what about when I say, don't worry, here's some trade information that comes from this accounting firm who happens to be my brother-in-law with a different last name, and you'll never figure that out, and I never actually did business with him. Well, I could have, I probably could have paid that bill. No, you just crossed the line, right? So you want us to get that right for you. We're doing that millions of times a day. That costs a lot of money to get that right. And if somebody says to me, why don't you put all of that out here and just give it away? well, okay, you know, I'm sure that the shareholders wouldn't mind and the board wouldn't mind, and I don't think I could sustain the quality and character of that information if I had to do it for free.
Yeah. And how do you balance, you know, just open data with quality?
Alcohol helps a lot.
Also, you see the missing unicorn will appear too, probably.
You know, it's never done. You know, you have to constantly be. There's always, I get, you know, three communications a day. Have I got a data set for you? You know, and usually with us, it's people that want to sell us their data, right? And I've been in business for nearly 15 minutes now, and I've got this great data, and I love the conversation about Uber. You know, I don't know whether I want to be, you know, betting on that data or not, because if I build a whole model around the network, the amazing network that creates of business people traveling, and, you know, what if I could just get the Uber drivers to click a box that says, does this appear to be a business traveler or not, right? And could you tell me where they went from and where they went to? And now if I could see that business travelers on some frequency appear to be going between, I don't know, this business and that business, and I don't know any connection between those two businesses, maybe that's a signal. Well, that's great. I just counted on the Uber driver who doesn't do that for a living, probably doesn't care about the quality of which box he checks, right? And I built a whole model around the fact that they're going to stay there, and then when that data goes away, I got to figure out how to replace it. And oh, by the way, if somebody knows that I'm doing that, they can game the system by paying a whole bunch of interns to get in cabs and drive between businesses and create false signals. So, you know, the bad guys are way smarter, and they don't have much to lose, and some of them are, you know, under legal age, and you can't do much with them. So we have to be really careful about how easy it is to fake the system.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Any final parting thoughts?
You know, honestly, without being overly, you know, sucking up to the previous comments, I think, you know, that nailed it. I think that all of these things that we're talking about being good stewards of the data, being good stewards of the organization, really clearly thinking about your role in your organization, why does it exist, what's your mission, what's your focus, by deciding we're living in a society right now where this is the beginning of the S-curve. We will either drown in our data or we will sort this out. And the people in this room are the ones that get to deal with that. This is the greatest opportunity in the world right now in the history of mankind. We're creating more data now. We can't even measure the rate at which it's increasing anymore. You get to do that. How cool is that? What a ridiculously big opportunity to mess up if you get it wrong. So no pressure. Good luck.
Thank you.
I look forward to your success.
Dr. Scrivignano, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This was wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, that's fun. We're going to take a minute just to get the panel set up here. Whoops, you got it? Great. Well, we have everyone assembling. I'm going to take a moment to introduce them. I also want to remind you to join the conversation by tweeting at the hashtag CDO Insights. That's CDO Insights. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your feedback on this discussion, and it is now my pleasure to kick off our panel discussion for today. Our speakers are Dr. Peter Aiken, author of The Case for the Chief Data Officer, Dan Morgan, Chief Data Officer at the Department of Transportation, and Scott Schaupt, Chief Data Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Our moderator for this morning's panel is Jack Moore, and Jack has really been writing, he is the NextGov news editor, he's really been writing most of our articles on the Chief Data Officer. And so, Jack, with you, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Connie. Jack Moore, news editor for NextGov, and just wanted to give a little bit of a setup for this panel, you know, why now? Since last summer, no fewer than 7 chief data officers at the large federal agencies, the CFO Act agencies, have been appointed. 2 of them join us on the stage today. This administration has really privileged data-driven decision-making. That's something that you'll hear a lot if you peruse budget documents, as I think everybody on the stage does. And just this past winter, the White House named the first government-wide chief data scientist, DJ Patil from Salesforce. So clearly, there's been increasing movement on this front. And a few months ago, we at NextGov decided to take a look, see what the CDOs were up to, and we wrote a feature, The Rise of the Chief Data Officer, and it got so much feedback, and we kept hearing from people, and people wanted the conversation to continue. So that's what we're doing today, continuing the conversation. And in a little bit, we hope to expand the conversation to you out in the audience, ask questions. These are truly the experts, and so, you know, if you have a question, jump in. I want to introduce the panel. We have Scott Schaup, the Chief Data Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, a longtime FEMA employee. Actually, he told me when he first started the agency, it was after the Northridge quake, and he was, you know, on the ground helping people sign up for assistance. So he has a, you know, deep internal view of the agency. To his left is Dan Morgan, the Chief Data Officer of the Transportation Department. He is a former contractor at Transportation working on enterprise architecture and IT governance. Before that was a supply chain analyst for the Navy, one of the sharpest thinkers on the, you know, kind of the philosophical role of the Chief Data Officer. He's taught me a lot about this role. And to his left is another leading authority on the Chief Data Officer in private sector and in government, Dr. Peter Aiken, founder of the Data Blueprint Data Management Consultancy, and also author of The Case for the Chief Data Officer. So with that long-winded introduction, and we've already, this morning, we've already had references to drugs and alcohol, so we'll try to keep it family-friendly for this panel. So if you could, we'll go down the line. Scott, just tell me about the Chief Data Officer role at FEMA. How are you approaching the role, and what conversations have you had with senior leadership about what they want the role to be?
Well, first of all, I want to say excellent job by the previous two presenters. Hit a lot of the key marks, so I hope you really took that to heart. The CTO jokes, I've been doing a lot of these the last couple months, and I feel like I need new material now after the first two presenters. He's been calling me Miley Cyrus, because you got to take it up a notch, get more and more dramatic every time you present in something like this. So the CDO position at FEMA, as you saw earlier, really came out of strong senior leadership. We have a strong deputy administrator with a technical background. We have a new CDO, a CIO from NASA, and our chief technology officer came from Microsoft Humanitarian Services. So they really brought a business approach to things and really saw, as I'm sure your organizations are going through, an explosion in the need for analytics to do data-driven decision-making. It's actually literally Strategic Objective 5.2 for FEMA right now. We have small analytics groups popping up across the organization. I see one of them in the crowd today. So what that led was the senior leaders realized we needed a central person. And I'll be honest with you, and Micheline had a great logo for her office, which is one of the things that impressed me the most about her slide deck. It is part of a brand, and what you do is the CDO basically is your evangelist and your champion to talk about the importance of data management, specifically around analytics. Analytics is prevalent in everything we do, and the federal government needs to go there. So I was in enterprise architecture, so it made sense for me. For the last 6 or 7 years, I started FEMA's data warehouse, so the word data came up, and people were like, well, Scott can handle it. But the word data is too prevalent, right? You can't have one person for that. So they put me in the position of CDO, and really it's just one more. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, and what that got me was a telemarketing job and a position at a front desk at a hotel, right? But now I've come to realize how critical that decision was, because it's a social change. It's about being somebody that brings these concepts that you've seen and brings them to the organization and sells them and implements them. So Micheline said we're not used car salesmen, but we kind of are. But what we're selling is data management, data quality, data governance, data analytics, and data-driven decision-making.
Dan.
So it'll be almost a year that I've been doing this Chief Data Officer thing. I think it's pretty true that, I thought I had a plan when I walked in the door, and all plans, get thrown out the window pretty quickly. About every data problem in the organization has been laid at my doorstep. So there's lots of challenges that we have. The business of transportation is changing, right? We're putting in NextGen at the Federal Aviation Administration. It's going to change the amount of data that we're able to gather to help you move more efficiently in the skies and keep you safe, right? There's connected cars, right? And we're working to build regulations that help cars talk to each other and talk to infrastructure to keep you safe on the road. We have so much that we are trying to do to improve how we make investments, right? The department itself embarked on this big study called Beyond Traffic. It was really trying to look at the broad trends that are really changing the transportation space, right? We've got a ticker up on our website about how the Highway Trust Fund is going to go broke. And we're trying to figure out how to make the most out of the money that we collect through the gas tax, right? So what we learned really was that somebody's full-time job needed to be on data so that we could make it better and put it to work. And that means a lot of different things, right? I've always broken it down into 3 tracks. Govern, right? So all the good stuff that we learn in enterprise information management class, right? It's a pretty settled science, but it's a really hard social science, right? Mm-hmm. How do you organize an organization to actually make a decision about how they can invest in data and make it better and make it more fluid? There's the engagement piece, so all of the open data stuff and data jams, data paloozas, but that engagement is also internal, right? We talk a lot about data as an asset, but data is a product too, right? When we're shipping it around to the organization and other people are using it, you have to manage the product. You're not just providing an authoritative data source, you're providing a service to the organization. And this product management mentality needs to come into the space of enterprise information management because you have to ship. You're not going to make a decision if your data is stuck in a legacy system. So you have to change the mentality. And then the technology enablement piece, I think everybody's trying to do an innovation lab or some sort of thing on big data. And certainly that's something that we're trying to look at the department.
And Peter, maybe give us a kind of state of the play with CBOs in federal government. In so many areas, the narrative is, the private sector is light years ahead and government is struggling to keep up. Is that the case here?
No, and it's actually kind of fun. So I go back in the federal government. I was a GS-14 in DISA SIM. Anybody remember that in the early 90s? Okay, got a couple of hands up there. DISA SIM was the group in the DoD that created the first enterprise architecture for the federal government, and it's still in use 25 years later. I've got authoritative measurements, quantitative measurements on more than 500 data management practices, and the federal government is in fact outperforming the private sector. So it's fine to say, federal government beat up on them and all this sort of thing, but as a former Govy and as a person who studies these areas, federal government is actually leading the way. We've had laws in effect. I authored part of Klinger-Cohen back in those days that said it's against the law to not do the things that you're talking about, which didn't help us a whole lot because we also were trying out of the geek community to try and say these things are important because you need to normalize these things, right? Anthony, your PhD is in leadership? Yeah. Right? That's the kind of thing that needs to happen. The social work behavior that you referenced earlier, Scott, is incredibly important to these aspects of it. Now, let's take this to what the role of chief means, though, really, and this is really where it comes down to it. We have a chief financial officer. They're responsible for the physical assets of the organization, and we expect those people to have certain qualifications, unless your company name was Enron. Somebody remembers that. Some people don't. We have a chief risk officer in organizations, and they have studied risk. They have certain qualifications. We have chief medical officer, and we don't ask the chief medical officer to go and perform surgery in most cases for organizations. Data is an asset, and you said that very well, Dan. You talked about how to productize it. But if we don't have somebody treating it as the asset, then we will never be able to have the recognition of the power that comes. And I don't know if you noticed on one of Micheline's slides, but it said there, we will never have less data than we have more right at this point in time, right? That's an interesting thing to think about, and of course it's going to continue to go up from there. So the goal here is to put something in place where we can get a handle on this asset and to start treating it as an asset instead of as a byproduct, which is what too often IT has treated it as. Let me make one more point here before we dive back in. And that is that the other thing we cannot do with data is treat it as a project. And unfortunately, we've spent the last 10, 15 years trying to teach IT how to do project management better. And that's a good thing, right? That has improved the quality of our IT outcomes over the years. But if you try to fit data into a project piece, the only possible outcome are more small piles of data that are lying around. This is true with Agile, it's true with Scrum, it's true with all of the things that we're trying to do in terms of developing this. Agile and Scrum are great ways to develop software, but if you try to develop data at the same time you're trying to develop your software, the outcome will be more small piles of data. And that's a wonderful thing, because then I'll have you guys as a customer, right? Small pitch, right? By the way, if you want a copy of the book that Jack mentioned earlier, come up here afterwards. I've got a piece of paper you can sign up for. We'll give you an evaluation copy of the book as well.
Scott and Dan, I'm wondering if, we're talking data, could you, bring it down to a ground level, tell us what specifically you're working with, and how can you, what does it mean to manage it, or is it kind of standardizing a format so you can use it again, or are you marrying up data sets to, kind of get new insights into something? Kind of give us some specifics about what we're talking about here.
I'll go first. So I think we've talked a lot about data analysts and the scientist role. And I think for the chief data officer, in reference to what you say, Jack, we're talking about championing the availability and the quality and the management of the data. We want to empower those analysts and those data scientists and those researchers to be able to create quality decisions and create those outcomes. So I'm working on better metadata repository. We're working on making sure we have a strong data inventory. Data quality is huge. We want to be able to, we have data governance now that started in October with FEMA. We're working on data stewardship. We're trying to move things from managing them from a database owner perspective to families or classifications of data that span all of your systems. And again, it's that social change perspective. But really what we want to do is empower the people that are working with the data on a regular basis in order to be able to make those decisions. And it's not about, I know that's maybe a later question, it's not about the tools. I'm not worried about a lot of heavy tools. You do have to have tools. We will have to have a metadata repository of some type. But an Excel spreadsheet is still better than what a lot of organizations may have now. So you want to look at ideas, people first, and the ideas they generate, and then the tools are really later if you can help it.
And Scott, real quickly, what kind of data does FEMA collect? Give us an idea of what information it really
Yeah,
tells.
so unlike earlier, we're really looking at the full spectrum of FEMA's data, because what we're trying to do is do a lot better with both trend analysis and predictive forecasting around emergency management. FEMA is effectively a grants organization where we provide either grants before, during, or after a disaster in order to empower our emergency management partners and help individuals and public entities. But what we haven't done that we need to do better, which I really feel is my primary role, is look across that whole life cycle. We have the flood insurance program in Crystal City. We have preparedness up at 800 K Street. We have a lot of our recovery systems are spread around the country for resiliency purposes. We're not looking at that whole broad spectrum. How does an early preparedness project that we fund today affect a disaster in 15 years? So what I need to do is get all of the data, even human resource data. How does the way in which we deploy our intermittent disaster employees to a disaster truly affect the outcome? You know, because unfortunately for FEMA, ever since Katrina, our mantra, we go three ways. We go big, and then go big. Because we can't go smart, because we know that we have to make sure that since Katrina, let's face it, we have to really make sure we hit the mark. Well, we've gotten to the point now where we really need to rethink that. So we need to figure out if sending 300 people to a disaster is really, truly effective. Maybe we have 120 and we do it smarter. So it's all of our data, financial data, it's all of it.
So to oversimplify the Department of Transportation, We're an operator, so the reason you can track where your plane is, right, is because the FAA is good at open data, right? We also operate the St. Lawrence Seaway, so we have the operational data, all those radar hits, all that data about where the planes are and how they're doing and all that good stuff, right? We have regulatory data. So roadside inspections, when you see a truck pulled over at one of those stations getting inspected, that's us and our state partners. We've got we've got the largest vehicle recall in the nation's history going on, right, with the Takata airbags. 34 million cars. There are 250 million cars on the road. It's huge. We provide the data for that. We try to get that data in as many people's hands as possible so that they can take an action to keep their family safe, right? We have regulatory inspection data on pipeline and hazmat safety and railroad safety, and all that data is open and available. It's available in a variety of formats and a variety of tools and a variety of websites. It's super hard to find, and even my own organization doesn't know where it is, right? So we're working on trying to improve the discoverability of that stuff. And we're a grant maker. We provide a lot of assistance to the states to help build your roads. We provide some guidance on how those roads should be built. There's a lot of data that feeds the highway design manual and some of the engineering things that go into how we build roads. We've got a lot of statistical data, long, large, fat statistical data sets around the condition and performance of the highway system, and the aviation system and the marine transportation system. The marine transportation system's fun. There's like 30 federal agencies involved with the marine transportation system. So super hard to get all of those guys to talk correctly, right? And there's an operating, grant making, and regulatory aspect to that thing as well. So I think really what we're trying to do first and foremost is get our hands around that inventory, and then I would like to assess the condition of those assets, but the truth is they just need to be more fluid, and the condition will be assessed when they get put to work. I don't need to spend a lot of time admiring the problem of whether or not my data is quality. We'll figure it out when people can actually put it to work, and then we can organize governance around that.
And we heard from Micheline's keynote earlier that the role is really in flux, and there's really not, I mean, there's some models that you can look to, but there's not any one particular, there's a variety of ways people are approaching the role. And there's kind of a split between the chief data officers who are kind of looking at the data internally to improve internal operations, drive business efficiencies, and that's what Micheline said her role was really about. And in government, a separate factor is open data in terms of releasing the data to the public, to entrepreneurs, to an app maker. And Peter, I'm wondering, in your book, Case for the Chief Data Officer, you said it's important for a Chief Data Officer to pick a priority in order to be successful. Can you do both, or do you really have to pick one and stick with it?
I think in some ways you can do both. Start off with what I consider three key priorities for a Chief Data Officer, and these guys have alluded to it already. First is that your data, as it exists in your organizations now, is probably done very well at the work group level. Individual work groups are doing tremendous work. You mentioned the multitude of data sets that you have to deal with on there. Imagine what would happen if your agency was able to take all that and start to harness it at an agency level, bring true power to it. You do that through a data strategy. And the idea here is you have to make some strategic choices. Strategy is always about deciding trade-offs. If you go for innovation, you're going to have a different kind of mindset than you're going to have if you're going for efficiency and effectiveness. And that's the first type of trade-off that you have to make when you're looking at these things. Second thing that you need to look at as a Chief Data Officer is reducing the amount of what we call rot in your organizational environment. ROT stands for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. Unfortunately, it's probably 80% of your data that's out there in that category. And so it's really just getting in the way, which is why you're not going to go in and try to improve the quality in all of it, because it doesn't make any sense if the data is redundant to make both of it better. Pick one and let's get started on it. The third piece of it, and this really goes back to the leadership function that was talked about in the previous section, is that you've got to start doing what I call monetizing that data, although in the federal government we're not always about money. Sometimes it's about bodies and saving lives and providing services and this sort of thing. For example, we did a real interesting project with USAID that's very similar to what you're looking at. How can they be more effective at what their mission is in terms of providing these types of ideas? Sharing those ideas back and forth and coming up with stories that leadership can grasp onto and say, oh yeah, that does make a lot of sense. We don't actually need to go after it with an army. We can go after it with a SWAT team and come up with exactly the same types of results, or even perhaps better results around there.
And one of the other things that Micheline had mentioned is, you know, the resources that are allotted to her office. She's been around for a while. She said she has nearly 50 data scientists or people, you know, working on her team. Other agencies are, you know, at an earlier place in their development. I know both Scott and Dan, you have been on the job for a year or less, so I don't think anybody expects you to have, you know, be fully staffed up yet. But what, you know, kind of give us where you are in terms of the maturity of your office and what you're able to do with that, and then also where you would like to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows that the budget process moves slower than you want it to do in the federal government, right? And so you try to you try to shift resources and be smart about how you do things. At the end of the day, I'm still a one-person office, but I do think my organization is serious about making an investment in chief data officering and making our data better and work smarter. DOT is big. We're 60,000 people. There's 10 sub-organizations, right? Like, you know, we're good at bureaucracy. It works. But that means that there's resources that exist inside the organization that help support us in improving the management and accessibility and quality of our data. And from that perspective, I work a lot with working groups, right? So, you know, but I'm not just working with IT people, and this is super important. I'm in the CIO's organization. If you read the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995, right, CIOs are supposed to have responsibility for the organization's information and the information resources. It's not just information resources. And there was nobody doing that. We were enterprise architecting and trying to be business driven, but nobody knows the business of the department. And we're not going to be successful if I'm sitting there behind my desk thinking really hard about what the best, you know, governance process is and writing a standard operating procedure that nobody wants to participate in, right? So I'm spending a lot of time with my business owners, helping them craft smarter questions, understand what their analytical needs are, working with our policy folks to understand how our data needs to line up with the way we want to be as a data-driven decision-making organization, what that really means for the department. Because there's really, you know, we just had Transportation Data Palooza, and one of my favorite quotes from that two-day thing was, there's no substitute for a passionate question, right? Because that will organize the rest of what we need to do around data. And so I'm out there working with, you know, our business and policy and mission and policy people, helping them understand helping them to form a better question that lines the IT people up to support them so we can get the data supply chain to work in advance of what we actually need to get done.
And Scott, tell us more about your office. Are you a one-man band at this point? Or
right, yeah, so I'm in enterprise architecture. I work for the CIO and the chief architect. But I will say, while I'm one person and I don't know what the office's structure will look like, we have a network across the organization. So we have staff in recovery that are part of an analytics group that are working on the data inventory. We have cells of people that are doing data quality, like some of our analytics groups across the organization. We have somebody in one of our housing programs who in a previous life was an engineer, and he has a lot of modeling background. He did a lot of the CDM. Really, the only staff that I have directly under my purview is our Open FEMA, Open Government program. I'm the project manager for that as well. And a lot of things we're doing is to push. Dan made great. I mean, that's been a great theme this morning, because I think the future in terms of government success around data is making data available to our partners, especially in FEMA. In the next 30 to 40 years, the largest growth area for FEMA is private sector humanitarian groups and nonprofit organizations, particularly small ones, that crop up during especially large disasters. And we have to be able to do our data collection and push that data out to our partners to the largest extent possible, so that FEMA's not everything to everyone. Instead of bringing trucks of water to a disaster, we help big box stores by clearing the roads, so they bring the water. And we have to do that by synchronizing and providing good logistics data on what we have, understanding what they have. So it's really part of a whole network in order to facilitate that, but we don't necessarily envision us having an office of 100 people, because what we're going to do is organize a matrix across the organization of people that are already doing these like things. Today at noon, we have what's called the Analytics Community Brown Bag. We get together once a month with our analytics community of interest. It started out with a room of about 6 people, and we'll probably have about 20 people in the room and maybe another 20 or 25 people on the phone, people that hadn't talked before about data and analytics. We have 4 10-minute lightning round sessions, people just talking about what they're doing, maybe bringing a problem statement. So you can build those kinds of networks, because all the things we've talked about today are happening within your organization. You just have to be able to network those together, and as the data champion, the data officer, that's kind of your job. That's the way I look at it.
Jack, if I can make these guys feel a little better, I was recently brought into a top 10 bank, obviously private sector at this point, and their chief data officer was also a single individual who was told they would not be getting any staff or any budget, and that their job was to persuade, influence, cajole, and just basically convince other people that this was the right path to take. So you guys are not alone in that, struggle upwards. And I'm willing to bet you guys have actually gotten further than the individual I was working with that was there, not through any fault of their own. Although we could contrast that with another bank that has taken all of their data functions, enterprise architecture, governance, and everything else, and put them under chief risk officer. So there's an interesting play as well. So we're seeing lots and lots of different things that are going on out there. We'll have to wait and watch and see what works.
Yeah. I mean, before we had CIOs or CDOs, there's plenty of people who have been doing data management stuff without this title for a long time, right? I'm like, the chief data officer title is a bunch of different things to different organizations. I mean, my CFO is kind of a data nerd, right? It's their job. And in the private sector, right, like we got ERPs because CFOs wanted them, not because CIOs were like, here, have SAP, right? There was a reason. There was a business reason for making sure that your financial data was right, because you were going to report earnings and you were going to be at risk, right? CFOs get it. Chief risk officers get it. Chief economists get it. They all get it. We're training all sorts of these folks to come out of school with the skills to put this data to work, right? But the organization is not positioned to provide them the data in a way that actually makes them successful. And that's the core of what we're trying to solve.
And Dan, you brought up title. I mean, this is Washington, so the title on your business card matters in some respects. How important could people be doing this kind of work without the title, which people, it sounds like, already are? And what does the title signal to the organization, perhaps? Anybody?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's, like I said, I talked about that logo earlier. Let's face it, it's a brand name, okay? And it's a brand name for data management. It's been absolutely critical in my organization. What it does is it allows people. I didn't get it as much at first when the chief technology officer Ted Okada kept going out of his way to saying we have Scott Schaup, the chief data officer, on the call. And at first I was like, oh man, that makes me sound so, I don't know. Why does he keep saying that? It was actually, I want to hide under the desk, right? But now I see what he was doing. He was applying that brand name that means something. And listen, the other thing he said when I came here this morning is I said, hey, you got any last minute advice? And he said, be humble and learn more than your audience. And so that's the other thing too, is we're all in this together, so I need to be learning about this constantly too. But having that brand and that moniker is absolutely critical. People start to pay attention to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an indication of seriousness, because the secretary is talking about the data that he needs, right? and the undersecretary is talking about how data needs to be driving policy, and our board of directors has given us all sorts of important mandates around managing the performance of the transportation system and getting the most for your federal gas tax dollar, right? I'm serious, right? And when the aviation system doesn't work because you're not getting the right data to move planes through the sky efficiently and safely, you feel it when you're stuck at the airport, right? It's a very real thing. And I think the trick here is we're having a conversation about what we need to do to improve at the policy and mission level, but then we're serious about it because there is a lightning rod for where all that stuff comes together and how we organize around those important questions.
And Peter, I know you have kind of agnostic about the title. It's really more what you're doing. Right?
Yeah, I wanted to call the book The Case for the Top Data Job, and my publisher said if you want to sell any copies at all, you'll change it to Chief Data Officer. But I absolutely agree. I've seen Enterprise Data Executive, I've seen Top Data Job, I've seen all kinds of things. The point is organizations know who does the data in their organizations, and they look to that person for leadership, and that person can reside at different levels in the organization. If you call it a Chief Data Officer, then there's an argument about do we need any more chiefs? Well, clearly your organizations have said yes, that's a worthwhile piece. We're going to try to get the second step, which is getting you some budget and staff, and that'll be the next recognition that it's not just a titular thing, but it's an actual function within the organization. You guys are going to, again, be the ones that are going to set that pace out because we don't have a critical mass yet to decide what's going to happen. It'll be fun to get together next year and see where we've gotten to on all this.
I mean, we're really good at titles in government, right? You know, there's the senior accountable official who has a chief that's underneath them that has a, an office of a deputy chief assistant to the whatever, right? But there's somebody's full-time job is data, bottom line, right?
Yep. I was just remembering my title when I was in DISA was the U.S. Department of Defense Reverse Engineering Program Manager. And I was probably doing the same thing you guys were doing at the time anyway. So,
Peter, you hit on the idea of, I mean, there are skeptics out there that say, why do we, there's kind of a trend toward these kind of fill-in-the-blank chief titles, and why can't the CIO do this? So I think it would be helpful, to kind of address why do we need why can't the CIO do this, for example?
About 10% of the CIOs are doing this very well. About 10%. So I'll have some people that, I'll forget to make a disclaimer like that at the front of some of my talks, and I'll have somebody stand up in the back and say, so, I suck, huh? Right? Yeah, forget to make that disclaimer, you're going to end up in that situation. On the other hand, is 10% the number that we really want to be successful with? No, we'd like it. Anybody happy in here with the way their data is being managed? Do you think they're optimal? Okay, it's a good sample size, right? These guys are available, right? And by the way, I mean that in the sense that in the federal government, it's a lot easier to share these successes than it is in the private sector. I get two banks together, and they're like, well, we can't talk to each other. You can talk about metadata. It's okay. It's really okay it's not against the law to talk about these things in there. But anyway, so about 10% are succeeding out there. And that's good. And they look at this and say, well, how else would you do it? But the other 90% do need some help, do need some error. And let's be frank, we haven't figured IT out. So, it's not really a good idea to expect that we would have figured out the data part of it as well. We've got a lot to learn in all these areas. The world's oldest profession, accounting, right, has literally several millennia of experience. When we talk about generally accepted accounting principles, they've been around. Double entry bookkeeping's been around as long as the Bible has been in print. Okay? That's a long time to get these traditions in place. We've been doing this about 100 years if we really stretch it. The British Secret Service is really where this started when they figured out that they were at war with the rest of Europe and there were 14 million persons of German descent living in the United Kingdom. It would be a good idea to have a 3x5 index card on each of those people, and then how were they going to manage those 3x5 index cards? It just became a very challenging problem.
And what about the people who say, the federal government has just elevated the role of Chief Information Officer for a long time? They had authority on paper, but it was a struggle to, get a seat at the table. And now we're like pairing off, maybe something that what they should be doing.
So it's a good idea to empower people who are responsible for things anyway, right? I mean, that just makes sense. On the other hand, we do have to be careful about IT not really driving the business. We really want the business to specify what IT should be doing. And that's why if we have a choice, we always advocate the CDO being, or the CDO function, reporting up through the business rather than reporting through IT, because IT is project-oriented and is still struggling with a number of different tasks that they have as well. We don't want to complicate their lives. They're having enough trouble as it is. Let's get back on the business side. Let business understand that they really own the data. They're really responsible for the data. They're really the people who can tell you the cost of a data quality challenge that happens, an oopsie, a breach. Again, I have my OPM data out there somewhere now in China, right? And I'm sort of going, And interestingly, when Target lost my data, I got, this particular piece. When OPM did it, I can now put in my medical accounts, right? There's all sorts of things OPM is giving me to now monitor on there, which I'm a little happy about. Right?
Scott, I was wondering, could you maybe give me, what are some of your priorities, short-term and also long-term projects? Is there, when people say, what are you doing as Chief Data Officer of FEMA, is there a flagship initiative or a big project that you point to that you're trying to drive success on? Well, and again, not to stress it too much, but we're kind of all in this together. So while I'm up here on the stage, we don't have all the answers either. So I can tell you what we're doing, and some of the things that are working for us is, yes, the Open Government Program is Open FEMA is kind of our flagship. It gives us the capability to have a conversation. But honestly, a lot about value in data management is about what I would call soft cost savings and soft cost avoidance. That 10 minutes you save for every employee in a day because you've automated a business intelligence report. That's hard to prove to a senior leader. So frankly, in order to show value, because a lot of these things are fragile, we have an administration change, we have this terrific deputy administrator and CIO, I don't know what's coming. So I'm looking for areas where I can show some short-term value, right? So latching on to a lot of our main modernization programs right now. We're going through a grants modernization, a financial modernization, and we're looking to redo the National Flood Insurance Program. Those have major impacts to the organization. So I've embedded myself the best I can with colleagues in enterprise architecture around being part of the conversation in the startup of those modernization plans, talking about the value of data management. But then the flip side also is working with analytics groups and answering every data question I possibly can. I had one yesterday. Somebody was looking at our declarations data, and she's looking at a human resources report and said, what's the data source for the declarations data? What data set should I use for the official source? Okay? The authoritative or single source of truth. Very simple question for me, but across the organization, that's all part of the learning mechanism. So that was the most important email I got all day yesterday, because I was able to show value. Even as the CDO, I was able to show value in terms of data management and knowing the single source of truth for one small but very important piece of data. So that's the short term. Long term is, of course, much more strategic. We want to modernize. We talk about Hadoop and the ecosystem, and I think the trend towards trying to move some of these things out of just being in the CIO shop. I've heard even CFOs, maybe it's follow the money. In my sociology degree, it was always about follow the money and follow the politics. That leads you to everything, right? So I could see a CDO being tied in with the CFO's office, or even in the administrator's front office, working with the chief of staff. And Dan, maybe give us some short-term projects you're working on, and then also, is there a big kind of flagship initiative that you really want to drive progress on in the long term?
I think really what I want to be able to do is aggregate risk for experimenting with analytics at the department level. I want to seed this innovation lab concept and start to organize more around experiments and pilots and really drive the experimental enterprise concept, because, frankly, the business can tell us their requirements, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of this new analytical capability that we're trying to create, they don't know their requirements, right? And if I sit in this space and be like, well, just let me know. I'll be here in a couple of years saying the same thing, right? So we need to create this experimental culture and be able to support it. So that's really sort of the near term, trying to figure out how we can resource it effectively and really line up not only tools but also talent to provide the business with some chances to do it. I think, you know, from a flagship perspective, I'm really hoping to try to get that product and asset mentality to work together inside the organization. I think it's not just the responsibility of the business, it's not just the responsibility of IT, it's got to work, you have to work together. It is a team sport. And you can allocate roles and responsibilities on a chart, and at the end of the day, people just need to be able to work together effectively. And we have to be in the business of taking care of our assets, but also making sure that we're treating them as products that are used across the organization, across other government organizations, right? You guys use our data all the time, right?
Right.
State and local governments use my data all the time to make an investment in your community, right? I use Commerce's data left and right, right? There's going to be more of this fluidity and access kind of problem. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get harder. But I need to be able to talk to the people who are trying to consume it and the people who are trying to provide it and make those connections most effectively.
Let me drop back into one more point. You've heard sandbox mentioned a couple times here. And what's most interesting about this focus on analytics in today's environment is that the best answer out of an analytics initiative is usually another question. Yep. And that drives IT crazy, right? Because they want to know those requirements. And you just said you could sit and wait for years and they would never get to it. So instead, what you're trying to do is foster a culture where IT can be more responsive and to say, this is the next answer that we want, and the next, and the next, and the next, which means their systems are going to have to go into that same fluid mode that you're describing there as well. And that's a very different mindset. We've never taught anybody how to build systems that way. Organizations are getting good at it, again, at the work group level, but we've got to inculcate that, I guess, if you will, at the organizational level to do better on it.
A little bit bigger picture for the future of the role. Peter, you've written a really interesting analogy that about perhaps showing that it's temporary or kind of transitory nature of the role, using the analogy of the chief electricity officer. Could you explain that?
So between 1880 and about 1920, if you were a CEO, your title was Chief Electrification Officer. Kind of an interesting thing. We don't have them anymore because we figured out how to do it, and we now don't need chief electrification officers. We simply assume that we can plug into the wall and do this. It's entirely possible that the CDO role will be a transitional role as well, and that 20, 40 years from now, we'll all be going, oh yeah, they were really stupid about how they used data back in the old days because they hadn't figured out how to do it. By the way, we don't teach data in any college curriculum outside of a few specialized data science courses. Every business student, every knowledge worker in the entire world should be getting a course in data as an asset. The only way that's going to change is if you all beat up on your local colleges and community colleges and start to put this in there, because the faculty right now don't see that there's any need for this. They don't see any problems. That's not a good situation.
Let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll wait for the mics to get you so everybody can hear.
Is it on? Yes. Hi, I'm Lisa Jenkins. I'm with EPA, and so our agency has a lot of interaction with both DOT and FEMA. What I wanted to ask about was, as a chief data officer, it seems like the focus is very much internal to your own agency, although you have alluded to working with other feds. I was wondering what is needed for doing better federal cross-agency data management, so that we, from a citizen-centric perspective, because citizens often don't even know what agency they're dealing with,
right,
we can be more seamless to the citizens.
I'll take a shot at it because I strongly believe that transportation lives in a context. It lives in an environmental context. It lives in a land use context. Right? I think I learned the other day that the drought in California has caused a shift in elevation. Like a measurable multiple inches shift in elevation. Do you think that introduces some risks to the roads that are built on that geology and the pipelines that run over that geology, that maybe we might be concerned about that? How do we sense that and build the use cases around it? I think it's we're still very work groupy and sort of, it's like it's heroes work to get two agencies to talk to each other. And I don't know why, right? It's the most frustrating thing in my life. I get safety people together to talk about the safety data initiative. Safety people love to share. Sure, here's my data, right? They're awesome because they care and they can make it. They can totally draw that line, and their IT puts them in such a terrible place to actually be able to do that. That they're handing USB drives around and shipping hard drives to people. That sucks, and we have to fix that. I think to give you an answer that kind of answers your question, I think IT needs to get clear that the data wants to move. It's a requirement that the data be able to move securely and safely, right? Period. And then we need to fix this culture problem where it's heroes work to move across government.
And we need to embrace certain standards and protocols. So I don't know about you guys, but the Data Act's a really big deal for me right now. They are establishing a financial protocol and data sharing standard for the federal government. And wow, I'm pretty jealous that they're able to pull that off, and we're also interested, right? I've been dabbling in NEAM for 6 years. Great idea, really hard to get there. So I think that there's some things that will come out through the White House and OMB over the years in terms of standards and protocols like the Data Act. We're seeing the light collectively in terms of data sharing. And so we need to do a good job implementing those things. FEMA, and this is coming for all of us. The Data Act's a big deal, but there's also part of FEMA appropriations for Sandy tied us to providing open government, to provide open data on our projects and our mission assignments. Before Open FEMA came in, we had our program offices posting PDFs on a daily basis. So that's really great for trend analysis, isn't it? Pull down a PDF of every day since Sandy and then do some data analysis. So we've turned those into machine-readable APIs based on our own internal data model, but with very strong metadata and instructions on its use. So those are the maturation steps. But eventually, I think the Data Act is really kind of revolutionary in that perspective.
And just those of you that are in the government that want to get together informally to discuss this, there is an informal group that's out there. I can announce it publicly here, but come up afterwards and I'll let you guys know what it is.
So this might be for Peter, and then you guys can comment in. I mean, my observation for on this, where people really took off in an organization that really kind of got it with data, it's like two factors. One was there was a burning desire. It sounds like, the Federal Reserve's in that category. So there's a problem that needed to be solved, and then they build an infrastructure to get there, and then the infrastructure was able to then drive all the other questions to be answered. Or it was someone who was really innovative, kind of got it, and then drove it before it was needed, and then it came. And I look around as across the government, you kind of don't see. You see those things. You stick a data officer in there, or chief data, a person of one. I mean, that's not going to change the culture. So the question is from your observations, I mean, the people who got the critical mass, to really turn what you're saying, because you guys are all talking about we should. So when is it going to be we are? What's the catalyst to drive an organization to actually get it? Create the structure, figure that out, and then actually drive forward. So I'll just make one other comment, like the Data Act. I'm in a CFO arena. And the Data Act is, it's minor data, but the good thing about it is if you can force the infrastructure to be created with that Data Act, it turns into, okay, now that I'm doing the 2%, but I built the capability to do 100%, now you have it. So I think the biggest challenge is carving out the funds to build an infrastructure to actually get the critical mass to do data analytics across the whole organization.
So Tim, your education, right? Okay, so how long have you been there? 2 years, okay. Well, I could tell you stories about education 20 years ago. And the idea was, you know, we'll build an IT architecture where they had a really strong data person who really wanted to do the right thing, but couldn't get any traction in there. And the other part was the helpers that they were getting in there. They weren't experienced enterprise architects. They didn't have, they're still there, okay? We won't mention any names then. Still trying. But really the passion is, and I think you described two models, right? One is that you've got a very passionate individual that does get to the top, or at least to a point of notoriety, or solves a problem. Again, they say there's nothing like focusing the mind like a noose in the morning, right? You know, if something bad has happened and you've got to go up in front of a congressional inquiry committee the next day, right? You want to get your ducks in a row. And maybe it's not the next day, but there's a reporting requirement or something along those lines. So certainly that's an incentive-driven approach. The other part of it is that some of the organizations do over time get more successful, acquire more like-minded people, and then that becomes a critical mass on their end as well. So we've seen both sides happen. What we have to be careful of is again, the if we build it, they will come. Right, that was sort of the mantra for many data warehouses. You know, if we build this gigantic data warehouse, it's going to solve all of our problems, and we'll clean the data up after we put it.
It'll also be our enterprise service bus, and that was the enterprise data warehouse was the original unicorn.
Yep.
Right, like.
And I think on that note, we started with unicorns. We're out of time. We're having to end it there. We're going to stick around, though. If you have additional questions, I'm sure any of these guys would be willing to chat with you afterwards. And thanks so much for attending.
Thanks for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of NextGov, Dun & Bradstreet and our distinguished speakers, and you, our audience, thank you for joining us this morning. Just as a reminder, we do encourage your feedback, so please, so we can get really good future events to you, so please just fill out the evaluation form. And we will be discussing this at NextGov Prime, which is September 9th. This will be an issue that we'll be talking about. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.